Talks over additional funding for small businesses stalled again in Congress Monday. Last week, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin requested an additional $250 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program. It was designed to help small businesses mitigate the economic fallout from the pandemic. Senate Democrats countered with their own demands, which would double the amount of aid and give money to hospitals and state governments. CBSN political contributor Molly Hooper joins me now. Molly, thanks so much for being with us. Remind us, why is Congress split over this additional funding?
Well, initially, we weren't sure that Congress was split because essentially all the Republicans wanted to do was plus up that money, initially $350 billion in aid for these small businesses. They wanted to add $250 billion to it because the White House is saying, and the Small Business Administration is projecting, that pretty much that $350 billion will be eaten up or taken by the end of next week. But when it came down to it, Democrats said, hey, wait, let's pump the brakes a second, because, we want to make sure that some of that money actually gets to underserved areas, small businesses in underserved areas that don't necessarily have connections and easy access to capital or to these banks. They don't have existing relationships with these banks that are going to be getting the money from the government to dole out. So lo and behold, they also wanted something else. They also wanted more money for the state and local governments that are having to deal with, not having enough funds to provide for the PPE, the protective equipment, and they don't have the money to pay for all these rapid tests. And so Democrats said, okay, well, we'll give you your $250 billion. That's okay. But we also want to make sure that this extra money for state and local governments is included as well. And Republicans said, no, we're not rewriting the bill. We're just making 3-word changes. We're changing it from $350 billion to $600 billion. That's the only change that would happen in the CARES Act, essentially. And Democrats put their foot down and they said, no, and remember, these members have been home for weeks and they're hearing from people directly in their districts. And they're saying, listen, we understand that small businesses need this money, but so do the state and local governments, as well as the hospitals and healthcare workers. So they said, we're not going to sign off on this. If you want to plus up that money, Congress will have to come back. And Congress is not going to come back essentially until May 4th at this point.
So, Molly, what does that mean for the Paycheck Protection Program? If it's running out of money soon, what exactly does that mean for these small businesses looking to take out loans? And then what is next for Congress?
Well, and that's the $1 million, or the bazillion dollar, the $1 trillion question, Elaine, as we get into the illions here. It's unclear because as the program is set up currently, the small businesses go to a bank, their local bank, and they apply for the loan. And it's up to the banks to actually give out those funds, essentially transfer the money into the accounts. And then after that point, the federal government will come in and, essentially refund this money that the banks have loaned. So at this point, we aren't quite sure exactly how much of that $350 billion has been sent out to the banks, because the banks are still deciding and they're still infusing these small businesses with cash. So they can't really, they can only ask for a certain amount of money as they lend money. And so at this point, Secretary Mnuchin says about $220 billion has been essentially obligated, right? The checks haven't necessarily been sent out or cashed to these banks, but that's how much the banks are asking for at this point in reimbursements. So that leaves, that's more than 2/3 of the money that would be available for those small business loans. Still, according to some Democrats on a conference call earlier today, their private weekly, or seems like it's daily these days, House caucus conference call, it sounds like some of the members of the small business committee think that number isn't necessarily accurate, that actually this $350 billion won't run out until the end of the month. So essentially the House and the Senate have about a week and a half more to play with here. So it does seem urgent, but the question is, which side's going to back down? And at this point, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are pretty entrenched in their position. And from what I understand, a source or two that I talked to who were on this call earlier today, the Democratic caucus is supporting them in this endeavor. And when you talk to Republicans, same thing I'm hearing about McCarthy and McConnell, that Republicans don't want to necessarily, go beyond just increasing that amount of money for the small businesses.
Interesting. All right. Well, so they have a little bit more time to work things out. Molly, what about the people who are supposed to be on unemployment insurance but haven't been able to access those funds? What can Congress do for them?
Well, see, and that's the question. This is why Congress is sort of in a challenging position right now, because as I said, all these members of Congress, 435 plus 100 senators, they're all home essentially, and they're in their districts. They might be in their houses, but they're still home hearing from people pretty much directly. And what they're hearing is that their constituents aren't able to access unemployment insurance very readily. So Nita Lowey earlier today, she is the chairwoman of the House Appropriations Committee, essentially the money committee. They are the check writing committee. She said that, this coronavirus issue is going to be with us, and it's going to be the source of several big bills in the future because of issues like the unemployment insurance access question. Each state has its own essentially way of dealing with unemployment insurance. And each state is very different. Different computer language, MS-DOS, data operating system. If you remember that, I mean, some of these systems are antiquated, whereas others are, they're modern and quick. And so, really, what's happening is Congress is trying to wrap its collective head around how do you sort of make this more uniformly easy to access in a very fragmented, systems in each state. And that's something that's very challenging for them. But still, Democrats and Republicans are trying to work on this, over the phones and through the various video conference calls, because they know that when they do get back, could be before May 4th, but at this point, Steny Hoyer said May 4th is probably what it's going to be. When they do get back, Congress is going to have some major legislation to really pass in order to, again, deal with issues like the unemployment insurance and other, other unexpected financial hardships that are happening to individuals in their districts.
And Molly, on that point, what are some of the other measures that we can expect Congress to consider to help ease the economic impact of the outbreak?
Well, one matter in particular that really both parties and, of course, President Trump has talked about, and we've been talking about this since essentially President Trump was elected, infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I don't necessarily just mean the roads and the bridges. We're talking about access to broadband, internet, water issues, various issues that need to be taken care of around the country, and essentially that would create sort of economic revival in various sections of the country, because you're putting people back to work if they're building or digging holes for the broadband wires, So both parties want to work on that, but it's a matter of how you get to that point in order to move forward with an infrastructure bill that would ostensibly put people back to work. Back in the $87 million stimulus days in 2009, that seems like a drop in the bucket these days. There was about a lot of controversy with so-called shovel-ready projects, and I think that that's something that Congress is also going to have to deal with. But if you listen to the House Democrats who are working on this, especially Peter DeFazio, who's the chairman of the Transportation Committee, there's a lot of ideas being circulated with some Republican buy-in, but, and this is something he has said to reporters, Republicans can't necessarily get too far out over their skis, because even though they might endorse some of these ideas, they don't want to do so without hearing from their leadership. And so I think that that's going to be important. But given the urgency of the situation and the pressure that every member of Congress is feeling from their constituents, Republican, Democrats, there's a lot of impetus to move forward on something that's less controversial, say, like an infrastructure measure, as opposed to some of the other more possibly controversial measures.
Right. It's at the same time, though, the question that is facing the president as well. How do you weigh all of these things against the uncertainty surrounding the health question of when is it safe to get people into those kinds of jobs and positions? All right. A lot of open questions right now. Molly Hooper for us. Molly, thank you so much. Really good to see you.
Nice to see you, Elaine. Thank you.